All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick's Around the Power. So today I wanted to make a video on Sergio Oliva. Now, I've done a couple of videos on Sergio in the past, but I've never really done a full, complete profile of Sergio and his competition history. I've talked about some of his rivalries with Arnold Schwarzenegger, some of the times where they went head-to-head and the outcome was controversial. I've also talked about Sergio's comeback in 1984. But I wanted to make a more standalone video about Sergio, just kind of detailing all the things that he achieved during his career, his posing, his accolades, his Mr. Olympia wins, his rivalry with Joe Weider, all the things that contributed to, making him the bodybuilder that he was remembered to be. So Sergio Oliva would begin his competitive career in bodybuilding in 1964, competing in the AAU Mr. America, where he took 7th place. In 1966, he would win his first Junior Mr. America, and then in 1966, he would also win the IFBB Mr. World. And then he would compete in his first Mr. Olympia ever, the 1966 Olympia, where he placed 4th. And obviously 1966 is the final year that Larry Scott won the Olympia. So Larry Scott won the first Olympia ever in 65, won his second Olympia in 66, and then he would retire from bodybuilding. So Sergio would win his first of 3 Mr. Olympia titles beginning in 1967. So he would win in 67, 68, and 69, making him a 3-time Mr. Olympia winner. At that time, that was the record for most Olympia wins. During that time, he also won the 67 IFBB Mr. Universe competition. Now in 1970, history would be made, and this would kind of mark the coming of Arnold Schwarzenegger, where Arnold would actually defeat Sergio Oliva, the reigning Mr. Olympia, at the 1970 AAU Mr. World competition, which was held just before the 1970 Mr. Olympia, which would be the Olympia where Arnold would finally dethrone Sergio Oliva and win his first of 7 Olympia titles. So Sergio being defeated in 1970 at that Mr. World competition is a very important moment in bodybuilding history. Now, even though the Mr. Olympia wasn't that old yet, this would be the first time in history, as I mentioned, that a reigning Mr. Olympia would be defeated outside of the Mr. Olympia competition. And this would not happen again until 2002, where Gunter Slierkamp defeated 5-time Mr. Olympia at the time, Ronnie Coleman, at the 2002 GNC Show of Strength, just weeks after the Mr. Olympia. So this is something that has happened very few times in bodybuilding history, seeing a reigning Mr. Olympia get defeated off the Olympia stage. Now, Sergio and Joe Weider would have a lot of ups and downs during Sergio's bodybuilding career, and this would really begin in 1970/71, where Sergio decided to go over to NABBA and compete in the Mr. Universe. So NABBA was the rival organization to the IFBB. I've said this many times, but prior to the IFBB, the NABBA Mr. Universe was the #1 most sought-after title in bodybuilding. So Sergio went over there to compete for that title, placing 2nd in the 1971 NABBA Mr. Universe. Now, the noteworthy thing about this is 1971 was the year the IFBB implemented their non-sanctioned policy in their bodybuilding competition. So what that meant was, if you competed in a rival federation and you were an IFBB pro bodybuilder, you could be banned or disqualified from upcoming Mr. Olympia competitions. And that's exactly what happened to Sergio in 1971, where he was banned from competing at the Mr. Olympia. And as a result, in 1971, Arnold Schwarzenegger was actually the only competitor to compete in that year's Olympia. And Sergio was not allowed, but he was allowed to guest pose at that show. So that is why you will see photos of Sergio on the Olympia stage in 1971 posing, but it was simply a guest posing. He was not a competitor in the 1971 Mr. Olympia. Now, the 1972 Mr. Olympia would be where the rivalry between Joe Weider and Sergio Oliva would really come to a peak, because in 1972 Sergio placed 2nd to Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Sergio claims he deserved to win that show, and many other bodybuilding fans think Sergio won in 1972 as well. And he went on to say that after he placed 2nd, Joe Weider told him that his ban from the Olympia was still in effect, and that is why he got 2nd place and did not win the show. And Sergio, there's kind of a lot of controversy about this, but in Sergio's own words, that's what happened. So after that 1972 Mr. Olympia, Sergio became very disgruntled, and he was obviously upset at the fact that, why would they let him compete if his ban was still in place? Why would they place him 2nd? Why would he have even been at the Mr. Olympia if he was still banned? And he thought it was kind of a bogus excuse for, Joe Weider allowing Arnold to win, because Arnold was obviously Joe Weider's golden boy, and, he saw Arnold as the future of bodybuilding. So Sergio felt that the competition was rigged in favor of Arnold, and, the whole ban thing was just kind of an excuse. So it was at this point that Sergio made a major move that would piss off Joe Weider, and that would be to go compete in Joe Weider's main rival, Dan Laurie, his bodybuilding organization known as the WBBG, or the World Bodybuilding Guild. Now, Dan Laurie and Joe Weider, I've done a whole video on this topic, but they were basically rival promoters that had a lot of bad blood between them. And when Sergio came over to the WBBG, it was a big deal in bodybuilding history to have, you know, a 3-time Mr. Olympia, basically one of the IFBB's best bodybuilders, to come over to another organization and start competing for them. So in that video where I talked about Sergio making a comeback to the 1984 Mr. Olympia, one of the things that I wanted to mention here was the fact that Sergio never retired from bodybuilding. He simply quit competing in the Mr. Olympia from 1972 to 1984, but he was still competing over in the WBBG, winning a slew of titles, including the WBBG Mr. Galaxy, the WBBG Mr. International, the WBBG Mr. Olympus, which he won about 3 times. He would compete in the WABBA World Championships, which he would win twice, and he would also win the WABBA Pro World Cup twice. Now, an interesting thing about the WABBA, or the World Amateur Bodybuilding Association, is this was another rival federation to the IFBB, actually founded by the French bodybuilder Serge Nubret, who many of you guys may remember from Pumping Iron. He actually founded it the year after Pumping Iron. So this was another guy that you could argue was pretty disgruntled with his placings in the IFBB. So he went on to start his own organization, WABBA. So it was pretty obvious that Sergio was trying to send a message to Joe Weider that he was pissed off, and he was going to these other organizations and winning all their major titles. So that would bring us to 1984, where Sergio Oliva kind of put aside his differences with Joe Weider to compete in the Olympia 2 more times. So in 1984, at the age of 44 years old, Sergio would come back and compete at the Olympia, placing a very respectable 8th place out of a very competitive lineup. Now, Sergio even said after the fact that he realized there was no chance that Joe Weider would ever let him win another Mr. Olympia title, but he wanted to try anyway, especially considering the fact that in 1984, Arnold had been retired for 4 years, so he knew he wasn't going to have to go head-to-head with Arnold anymore, so it was kind of a new era in bodybuilding. He thought the time was right to jump back on stage. And I've got to say, as far as comebacks go, Sergio Oliva had a very impressive comeback. His physique was very impressive, very thick and very dense. You could even make an argument he was bigger than at some points in his career when he was still with the IFBB. So Sergio would compete at the Olympia one final time in 1985, again placing 8th, and that would be essentially his retirement from bodybuilding. And again, that's where you see the iconic photos of Sergio holding up his son on stage. His son, obviously Sergio Jr., who is an IFBB pro today, most notably winning this past year's New York Pro competition. And how iconic will it be when Sergio finally competes on the Olympia stage? He'll be the first bodybuilder in history to be a legacy Mr. Olympia competitor. And what I mean by legacy is a son of a former Mr. Olympia winner competing in the Mr. Olympia competition. Has never been done before, and it will be a giant moment in bodybuilding history when Sergio Jr. decides to step on that stage. Now, unfortunately, Sergio Sr. is no longer with us. He passed away back in 2012 at the age of 71 years old, but he certainly did leave a pretty impactful legacy on bodybuilding. Not just in the sense of the titles that he won, but his posing as well. I mean, his victory pose, which he pretty much trademarked, became one of the most iconic poses in bodybuilding. That kind of overhead, kind of a variation of a front double bicep pose, where you've got the lats flared out. It shows your V-taper. It shows the size of your arms. It shows the size of your forearms. You've got your quads flexed. It was just a very iconic pose for that era, and you see many bodybuilders today trying to replicate that pose, and very few of them can pull off that pose like Sergio pulled it off in his prime. I think Lee Priest is one of the few bodybuilders that can pull off that pose in a way that's almost as impressive as Sergio Oliva's, but I think no one will ever have the same victory pose as Sergio. And of course, even though Arnold defeated Sergio and took the Olympia title from him, Sergio still remains only one of 3 men to ever defeat Arnold Schwarzenegger in a bodybuilding contest. So that is a very big distinction. And then, of course, you had Sergio changing the history of bodybuilding by forever changing the rules in the IFBB with that 1971 non-sanction policy, which, again, many people feel that Sergio Oliva was the sole reason that that policy was created, and that is a policy that remains in place to this day. And then just a quick overview of Sergio's stats. I mean, he was about 235 pounds on stage, or 106.6 kilograms at a height of 5'10", which for that era in bodybuilding was a pretty big bodybuilder. And he also sported a very impressive 27-inch waist, which is part of the reason why he had one of the greatest V-tapers of all time, and a major part of the reason why his victory pose looked as impressive as it did. So that is the video, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please give it a thumbs up if you did enjoy it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.